Christmas Eve has a way of making old memories sound louder than Christmas music. Perhaps that's why, as I turned onto Maple Ridge Drive that evening, I found myself smiling at the familiar rows of glowing porch lights instead of thinking about the dinner waiting inside my parents' house. Every December, the neighborhood looked exactly the way it had when Ethan and I were children. White lights wrapped around maple trees. Inflatable snowmen leaned slightly in the winter wind. Someone, somewhere, was always burning cinnamon candles that drifted into the cold air. Some things seem unchanged for years. People rarely do. I parked my dusty pickup beside a row of polished luxury SUVs and glanced at my reflection in the window. My Navy warehouse jacket still carried the Crestline Logistics employee badge clipped neatly above my heart. The edges were worn from years of daily use. I reached for it without thinking. My grandmother used to tell me that a uniform never reveals a person's worth. It only reveals the work they chose to do that day. The rest, she would say with a quiet smile, lives where no badge, title, or paycheck can ever reach. That thought stayed with me as I walked toward the front door. The laughter inside stopped for just a second when I entered. Then my mother smiled politely. "Claire, you made it." She hugged me quickly before stepping back to look at my jacket. "You came straight from work?" "I did." "You could have changed." "I didn't think it mattered." Across the living room, my older brother Ethan raised his glass. "There she is. Our hardest-working warehouse coordinator." Everyone laughed. Not cruelly. Not loudly. Just enough to remind me they had already decided who I was long before I walked through the door. His wife, Vanessa, adjusted the elegant folder resting beside her plate. "We actually have something exciting planned after dinner." My father grinned. "It's a family conversation." I had heard those words before. Family conversation. They usually meant someone had already reached a decision, and the meeting was only there to make it sound like everyone had a voice. I took my seat quietly. The smell of roasted turkey filled the room. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently beneath the porch light. Inside, I had the unmistakable feeling that this Christmas dinner wasn't about celebrating the past. It was about deciding someone else's future. Dinner began the way so many family dinners do. Someone passed the mashed potatoes. Someone complimented the turkey. Someone laughed a little louder than the joke deserved. For a few quiet minutes, it almost felt like we were simply a family sharing Christmas Eve. Then my father set down his fork. "Claire," he said, folding his hands together, "we've all been talking." There it was. The family conversation. My mother smiled with the gentle expression people often wear before delivering something they believe is for your own good. "We're worried about you." I nodded politely. "I appreciate that." "You've spent too many years in that warehouse," she continued. "You're 34 now. Don't you think it's time to build a real career?" Before I could answer, Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You've always worked hard. Nobody's questioning that." He smiled, almost kindly. "But hard work alone doesn't lead anywhere." Vanessa slid the elegant leather folder across the dining table until it stopped in front of me. "We've actually prepared an opportunity." I looked down. On the cover were the words, "Employment Agreement." Ethan rested both elbows on the table. "My executive assistant is retiring next month. You already know scheduling, shipping, and organization. I think you'd be perfect." My mother beamed. "The salary is $42,000 a year." My father added proudly. "Benefits, paid vacation, stability." The room became very quiet. Everyone was watching me. Not to hear what I thought, but to see whether I would finally become the version of me they had imagined all these years. I opened the folder slowly. Everything had already been prepared. My name. My job title. Even a space waiting for my signature. As I closed the folder again, my eyes drifted toward the employee badge clipped to my jacket. Vanessa noticed. She smiled politely. You won't be needing that old thing anymore. For just a moment. My fingers rested lightly against the worn plastic badge. I remembered my very first day at Crestline. The warehouse manager had handed it to me and quietly said, "No matter how high this company grows, never forget the people who move every box. Some lessons become more valuable with time. Others reveal their value only when someone else mistakes them for something small." I looked back at my family. Then I smiled. "Thank you," I said softly. "I'll think about it." No one noticed that I hadn't reached for the pen. No one spoke for a few moments after I closed the folder. The conversation drifted back to holiday recipes, neighborhood decorations, and Ethan's upcoming presentation to Crestline Logistics. If someone had walked into the dining room just then, they would have believed they were watching an ordinary Christmas dinner. Sometimes the deepest tensions were the warmest smiles. Vanessa stood and gathered several printed reports from the sideboard. "I should double-check tomorrow's numbers," she said with a light laugh. I promised Ethan everything would be perfect. She carried the papers toward my parents' home office. A few minutes later, I quietly excused myself to refill my coffee. As I passed the hallway, the office door stood slightly open. Not enough to invite someone inside. Just enough for me to notice the projection screen glowing across the room. Rows of financial charts filled the screen. Revenue. Operating margins. Regional growth forecasts. My eyes paused on one particular graph. Only for a second. Then a second became much longer. One percentage didn't match the quarterly report I had approved only 3 days earlier. Another growth figure had been adjusted upward. Not by much. Just enough to make the presentation look stronger than reality. Vanessa didn't notice me. She was changing numbers with calm confidence, rehearsing tomorrow's presentation beneath her breath. "I'll explain the revised forecast." Click. "I'll emphasize projected expansion." Click. "I'll skip the inventory delay." Click. I quietly stepped away before the floorboards could creak beneath my feet. Back in the kitchen, my grandmother Evelyn looked up from her cup of tea. She didn't ask where I had been. She simply looked into my eyes for a long moment. Some people don't need explanations. They recognize concern before a single word is spoken. She gently patted the empty chair beside her. "Sit with me for a minute." I did. For a while, neither of us spoke. The Christmas tree reflected softly in the living room window. Children outside were laughing as they pulled sleds across fresh snow. Grandmother wrapped both hands around her tea. "When I was younger," she said quietly, "I used to believe families were strongest when everyone agreed." She smiled gently. "It took me many years to understand that healthy families aren't built on agreement. They're built on honesty." Her words settled into the silence between us. I glanced once more toward the hallway where the office lights still glowed beneath the door. Tomorrow's meeting suddenly felt much larger than a business presentation. And somehow, I had the feeling my grandmother already knew why. Grandmother Evelyn waited until the laughter in the dining room grew louder. Then she slowly stood. "Claire," she said softly, "would you help me upstairs for a moment?" No one questioned it. To everyone else, she was simply an elderly woman asking for a little assistance after dinner. I followed her to the second floor. Her bedroom was exactly as I remembered it from childhood. The same handmade quilt. The same rocking chair beside the window. The same tiny music box resting on the dresser, its gentle melody filling the room whenever she wound it by hand. She closed the door behind us. For a long moment, she simply looked at me. "You saw something tonight." It wasn't a question. I nodded. "I think I did." She sighed, not with disappointment, but with the quiet exhaustion that comes from carrying a truth for too many years. Without another word, she walked to the old cedar wardrobe. Hidden behind a row of neatly folded blankets was a small iron lockbox. From around her neck, she removed a thin silver chain. A tiny brass key rested against her heart. "I've worn this every day for almost 12 years. She unlocked the box. Inside were neatly organized envelopes tied with faded blue ribbon. Old deeds. Bank documents. Handwritten letters. And one thick envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's careful handwriting. I stared at it without touching it. Grandmother gently placed her hand over mine. Not everything inside will make tonight easier. But it will help tomorrow make sense. Outside the bedroom window, snow continued falling in slow, peaceful silence. Inside, time seemed to stand still. When your grandfather became ill, she whispered, he asked me to keep these safe until the day I believed you were strong enough to carry them. A tear gathered in the corner of her eye, though she quickly smiled through it. I kept waiting for the right Christmas. She looked at me with the same steady kindness she had carried my entire life. I think this one finally arrived. Carefully, I opened the envelope. The first page wasn't a will. It wasn't a financial record. It was a handwritten letter. At the top, in my grandfather's familiar script, were 7 simple words. For Claire, when the truth becomes necessary. I didn't read the letter all at once. Some truths deserve more than hurried eyes. I sat beside my grandmother's window while the Christmas lights outside shimmered against the fresh snow. The first page wasn't filled with legal language. It sounded exactly like my grandfather. Simple. Steady. Honest. Asterisk, if you're reading this, Claire, it means silence has lasted longer than I ever wanted. Asterisk. I paused. Even after all these years, I could almost hear his voice. Asterisk, this family has always admired people who stood at the front of the room. I hope one day they'll learn to appreciate the people who quietly keep the room standing. Asterisk. My grandmother watched me without interrupting. She knew which sentences needed room to breathe. The next envelope contained copies of land records. One signature. Then another. Then a transfer document. The handwriting looked familiar. Too familiar. My father's name. My mother's initials. A property transfer completed only weeks after my grandfather entered hospice care. Except one signature didn't belong there. Mine. A signature I had never written. I slowly lowered the papers. Grandmother closed her eyes for a brief moment. I argued with them. They told me it was only temporary. They said Ethan needed collateral to secure his first business loan. Her voice never carried anger. Only sadness. I wanted to believe families always find a way to make things right. She gently touched the brass key resting on the bedside table. But promises become heavier every year they're left undone. I looked again at the documents. The small piece of inherited land wasn't valuable because of its size. It was the place where my grandfather had taught me to count freight trains when I was 8 years old. The place where he first explained that every truck, every warehouse, and every loading dock represented someone's honest work. No one had taken only property. They had quietly taken a piece of memory. A piece of trust. I slipped every document carefully back into its envelope. I won't fight them tonight, I said softly. Grandmother smiled. I know. What will you do? I looked toward my worn employee badge resting against my jacket. Tomorrow morning. Everyone would be walking into Crestline believing they already knew exactly who I was. For the first time that evening, I realized I no longer needed to correct them. The truth was already on its way. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of quiet only fresh snow can bring. The roads were nearly empty as I drove toward Crestline headquarters. Sunlight reflected off the glass building, turning it into a mirror against the pale winter sky. I parked in the employee lot. The same place I had parked for years. The security guard at the entrance smiled the moment he saw me. Merry Christmas, Ms. Whitmore. Merry Christmas, Ben. He held the door open as he always did. Nothing about this morning felt unusual. That was exactly how I wanted it. Inside the lobby, employees hurried between elevators carrying coffee cups and presentation binders. Some waved. Others simply smiled. No one cared how expensive someone's suit looked. Here, people were known by the way they treated one another. As I crossed the marble floor, my fingers briefly brushed the worn employee badge clipped to my jacket. It had been with me since Crestline opened its first distribution center. Corners faded. Plastic scratched. Still, I had never considered replacing it. Some things become valuable not because they're new, but because they've quietly witnessed who we've become. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. Claire. Sophia Mercer, our chief operating officer, stepped out of a conference room carrying a tablet. She smiled warmly. I hope your family dinner was peaceful. I returned the smile. It was memorable. For just a second, her eyes rested on my expression. She understood there was more beneath those words. But she respected silence enough not to ask. Instead, she handed me a slim folder. The audit team is ready. So is legal. And the board has reviewed every document. I nodded once. No surprises today. None, she answered gently. We'll simply let the truth introduce itself. There was something comforting about those words. Not because they promised victory. Because they carried no trace of revenge. Only clarity. As we walked together toward the executive floor, I glanced through the glass wall overlooking the warehouse below. Forklifts moved steadily between loading lanes. Workers checked shipments with the same care they showed every ordinary morning. Watching them, I remembered something my grandfather once told me. A company isn't built inside the boardroom, Claire. It's built every time someone keeps their promise when no one is watching. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. Across the hallway, Ethan, Vanessa, and the rest of my family were just arriving. Vanessa smiled politely as she handed me a heavy leather briefcase. Claire, she said, would you mind carrying this into the meeting? I accepted it without hesitation. Of course. Sometimes. The shortest walk becomes the longest journey a person will ever take. The boardroom overlooked the entire city. Winter sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long reflections across the polished conference table. Everything felt calm. Orderly. Professional. Exactly the way important decisions should begin. Ethan stood confidently at the front of the room. Vanessa arranged her presentation slides with practiced precision. My parents sat proudly near the center of the table, smiling whenever someone greeted Ethan as Mr. Whitmore. I quietly placed Vanessa's briefcase beside the presentation screen. Then I took a seat near the back wall. No one questioned it. To my family, it was exactly where I belonged. Before the meeting began, Ethan leaned toward me. When the presentation starts, could you take notes? And if anyone needs coffee. He smiled. You know where the break room is? I do, I answered gently. He nodded, satisfied. There was no cruelty in his voice. Only certainty. Sometimes certainty can become the quietest form of blindness. The directors gradually filled every chair. Legal counsel entered. The internal audit team followed. Then Sophia Mercer walked to the front of the room. The conversation slowly faded into silence. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin Mr. Whitmore's presentation, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on the day after Christmas. She spoke with her usual calm confidence. This partnership has been months in the making. Vanessa smiled proudly. Ethan straightened his tie. Their presentation began. Charts appeared on the large screen. Revenue. Expansion plans. Projected growth. Every sentence sounded polished. Every answer sounded prepared. From where I sat, I recognized every number that had been quietly adjusted the night before. I didn't interrupt. Truth rarely needs to compete with confidence. It only needs the right moment to arrive. 40 minutes later, Ethan finished. The room filled with polite applause. He smiled toward my parents. Then toward Vanessa. Finally. Toward me. Almost as though expecting approval. Instead, Sophia remained standing. She didn't applaud. She simply looked around the room before speaking again. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. There is only one item remaining before the board begins its discussion. She turned toward me. Her smile was warm. Respectful. Unhurried. Claire. Would you join us at the front of the room? Every face turned. My mother looked confused. Vanessa frowned slightly. Ethan gave a small laugh. I think you've mistaken my assistant for someone else. Sophia's expression never changed. No. She answered softly. I've been waiting all morning to introduce the person who built this company from the very beginning. The room became perfectly still. I stood. Slowly unclipped the worn employee badge from my jacket. Then turned it over in the palm of my hand. On the back, engraved beneath years of gentle wear, were two quiet words. Employee #0001. For one long, quiet moment, no one moved. The room remained perfectly still, as though every sound had been left somewhere outside the boardroom door. Sophia stepped beside me. Her voice carried the same calm professionalism it always had. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to formally introduce the founder and majority shareholder of Crestline Logistics. She smiled toward me. Claire Whitmore. No dramatic music. No raised voices. Only silence. Sometimes the truth enters a room so gently that it changes everything before anyone realizes it has arrived. Ethan blinked twice. I'm sorry. There must be some misunderstanding. Sophia shook her head. There isn't. She handed a leather portfolio to each member of the board. Inside were the original incorporation papers. The first page bore only one signature. Claire Whitmore. Founder. Employee number 0001. My father slowly leaned forward, staring at the documents as though they belonged to someone else. My mother whispered. Claire. You never told us. I looked at her gently. You never asked. There was no bitterness in my voice. Only truth. Sophia continued. Miss Whitmore requested that every employee, including herself, begin their careers on the warehouse floor. She believed leadership should understand every shipment before making decisions about people moving those shipments. Several directors nodded. One smiled quietly. They had known that story for years. My family had never heard it before. Vanessa suddenly spoke. But, yesterday, you were wearing a warehouse uniform. I still am. I glanced down at my jacket. I've worn one almost every week since this company opened. A few soft smiles appeared around the table. Not because anyone was laughing. Because they finally understood something that titles alone could never explain. Success had never changed the way I saw work. It had only given me more opportunities to respect it. Sophia gently closed her folder. There is one final matter before today's meeting concludes. She looked toward the internal audit team. Yesterday evening, several financial discrepancies were voluntarily reported by Miss Whitmore. The room grew quiet once again. Vanessa's confident smile slowly faded. She instinctively reached for her presentation binder. It wasn't there. The audit director calmly placed another folder in front of her instead. Its cover contained only 3 simple words. Independent review requested. I looked once around the room. Then toward the employee badge still resting in my hand. My grandfather had once told me that people spend far too much of their lives trying to prove their importance. Real purpose, he believed, never needs to announce itself. It simply keeps showing up. Until the truth is finally ready to be seen.